I want to talk to you about podcast sponsorship. And the thing is that when you have a podcast, of course, you got to think about revenue avenues all the time. And sponsorship can actually be a great opportunity to actually bring in a little bit of cash and actually beef up your balance sheet. Okay, so here's an overview I want you to think about. When you think about podcast sponsorship, you really need to really understand that long before Patreon and other search platforms existed, podcast sponsorship was the way most creators monetize their content. It is still actually a popular method to this day. So, and often how the bigger shows earn a crust, because the whole thing is that how much can you really earn through Patreon when you think about it? Okay, so the sponsorship thing is that you are actually forging a relationship with industry players who have who actually have an interest in making sure that your podcast succeeds because you have been able to build a community that they care about. So podcast sponsorship is an option for shows with numerically smaller audiences too. Providing their topic and niche is actually a good fit, because the thing is, if you have only 1,000 listeners, but those listeners are really, really dedicated listeners, then you might actually be let's say a good like a good potential for a good potential for a sponsorship. So if you run a business and have been approached by sponsors about potentially doing podcast sponsorship, you can also take the chance, because the whole thing is that you have an opportunity to actually expand your reach. So what is a podcast sponsorship really? Well, the thing is that when it comes to podcast sponsorships, it means that you are trying to monetize your content. That's all. But when it comes to monetization, you have different ways of doing so. For one podcaster, the thought of covering his or her web and hosting cost is enough. Maybe even to have enough left over to treat their other half to a nice meal every couple of months. For another, it could be an essential income stream in their business, where they're actually paying a team of freelancers and assistants to work on their show. So ultimately, podcast sponsorship is simply a form of the age-old marketing tactic where someone has assembled a crowd and someone else would like to advertise a product or service to that crowd. So that's really as simple as that. And now, the strength of podcasting is that you are actually having a very stable avenue for revenue. Okay, most podcasts that succeed actually focus on a certain topic or niche. That means what? It means the audiences that build around them generally share a common interest. This could be anything from losing weight to breeding gerbils to collecting stamps or even brewing coffee, right? It's all about making sure that you have a community that you can monetize. So when you think about I want to really share with you the methodology when it comes to podcast sponsorship. It's very important to understand that when you think about podcast sponsorship, you can't really have a short form audio content. I mean, you can have that, but it's just better if you have long form audio content, because it means listeners can spend lots of time listening to a presenter in a very intimate and regular way. So if you have 5 minutes versus 30 minutes, you see the difference there, okay? Because when you have this very intimate environment, this builds a layer of trust and authority. It's much harder to do this in the written word, where blog posts are googled and skimmed for one piece of info the reader wants. So in terms of methodology, how podcast sponsorship really works. At the most basic level, the advertiser pays to have their product or service promoted on one or more podcast episodes. Pretty straightforward, nothing really complicated. And commonly, podcasts deliver ads in one or two ways. You have the host reading ads, and you have radio style ads. Pretty straightforward. So host read ads. This is the most effective way. Okay, so the host is actually talking about the product or service. They'll tend to mention why they recommend it, some examples about how they themselves use it, how they benefit from it, and why the listener would too. Done well and legitimately, a host read ad can be just another part of the episode content instead of sounding like an interruption. So that's for the host read ads, not the host read. I'm sorry, the host read ads. Okay, and then you have radio style ads. So an alternative is for a third party to create adverts. This way, the podcaster simply has to play them on their episodes. This is actually a lot less effective because the audience listens to hear the thoughts and opinions of a presenter. Having a random voiceover interrupting the content to quickly give you a sales pitch can be jarring and even annoying, and listeners can fast forward or tune out as soon as they hear the change in cadence or a background sound. Now let's talk about placing of ads. An advert might appear at the very beginning of an episode, the very end, or somewhere in between, and these slots are known as pre-roll before the content starts, mid-roll during the main content of the episode, and post-roll after the content has finished. Okay, and mid-roll is the most desired spot and thus the most expensive. Listeners are less likely to skip this content. Post-roll is the least optimal position for an ad, but it's also the cheapest when you think about it. So it's a great to think about that. Now, in terms of creating a good podcast advert or a sponsorship slot, it really depends on the quality of your show, but also the opportunity that you're trying to present to the sponsors. Because if you are having a great show, a very loyal listenership, and you are giving like a pretty interesting prices, you are going to attract the right sponsors for your show, and those sponsors will actually monetize either through pre-roll, mid-roll, or post-roll, depending on how you set things up with them. Let me give you a few pro tips here. Let me give you some good podcast sponsorship best practices. If you plan on doing some podcast sponsorship in your content, there are a few things to be aware of, either to optimize your efforts or to keep you out of trouble. It's one of those things where transparency is the first thing you want to think about. Transparency. You want to be transparent with your audience, and you want to be forthcoming. Okay, so declare them. If you are taking money to advertise anything, then you need to make that clear to your listeners. A quick thanks to Jim's Underpants Emporium for sponsoring this content will do the trick. Adverts need to be clearly marked as such and not sound like you just so happen to be waxing lyrical about Jim's wife fronts as part of your episodes. Okay, so this goes back to what I said earlier about being transparent. You want to be you want to really establish an environment of truthfulness, an environment of integrity with your audience, and they will trust you more. I mean, your audience knows that you are a podcaster and that you need to live. You need to also you need to eat. Literally, you need to actually bring in revenue. So they will basically accept that. Okay, but you have to be transparent with them. You also want to create special links. So a tool like Pretty Links is a great way to send your listeners to your sponsors. Here, you can make memorable links that are easy to read and remember. You can also track the clicks to measure the effectiveness of your ads too. So that's kind of cool. And some sponsors will even create discount coupon codes which help track effectiveness too. So this is kind of similar to affiliate marketing. If you know a little bit about this is actually a great way because you are having a custom link to actually specify your offer. You can also create a space. So another good practice is to send your listeners to a bespoke page, whether that's on your own site or to your sponsors. And this page will contain all the info about your call to action, as well as any discounts or special offers. And having a page like this makes it easier to track engagement and encourage more conversions and sales too. I mean, this can be a landing page, by the way. It can be a landing page. It can be anything else, okay? But having a landing page, a dedicated page, is kind of cool because it allows you to actually track, let's say, leads in the sales funnel. In case you have a sales funnel or your sponsor has sales funnel, you're able to track things a lot more clearly. When you think about how does podcast sponsorship work, you also need to think about the types of sponsoring that you are really you're really focused on. And I want to talk to you quickly about sponsoring a fiction podcast. There are great opportunities to be found in sponsoring fiction podcasts or audio dramas too. I mean, those shows tend to have really hardcore, fanatical followings. Again, though, just dropping a pre-recorded advert into an episode is never going to take advantage of that. So some of the best adverts that you'll hear in podcasts will be on fictional shows because the makers can really get creative with them. They can build them right into the story world. Okay, that's really a great way to think about things going forward. In Wooden Overcats, which is a sitcom following the antics of two rival funeral directors, You'll hear some outstanding examples of their Bruno Mattress commercials, and this is kind of cool. And with fiction podcast, it's really obviously a little harder to nail down listeners' interest and demographics, but producers tend to know their audience well, the audience as well, and a quick chat with them will help establish whether or not you are a good fit for each other. Okay, and you got to be a good fit for each other, because otherwise you're just actually wasting a lot of time. You're wasting a lot of resources. You're wasting a lot of Alex, what we call Alex. So that's actually a listener experience, and listener experience is actually the number one asset you need to think about, especially if you are trying to build an audience and monetize that audience in the long run. Because when you think about podcast sponsorship, everything revolves around the audience. If the audience is not willing to follow through, and is not willing to follow the instructions, not the instructions, the suggestions of the host, then it's not really worth it, not only to the host, but also to the company. I want to talk to you about money here because ka-ching, ka-ching, ka-ching. When you think about podcast sponsorship, you have to really think about the cost. Now, the cost actually, there are several possibilities here. When you think about how much podcast sponsorship cost, there's certainly no one-size-fits-all answer here, and lots of variables to consider. That's what's known as the CPM model. So CPM model, cost per milli, cost per thousand listeners. This is a method of measuring advertising based on audience numbers. So typically, podcasters stand to earn around $20 per ad per 1,000 downloads within 30 days of an episode's release. Now, of course, the niche, your niche, will play an important role when it comes to how much advertisers are paying. And CPM can work well for podcasts that have download numbers, let's say in the thousands, but many podcasts have much smaller audiences than that. So a smaller audience doesn't make it any less valuable though. In fact, the opposite can be true. The more hyper targeted it is. So imagine you ran a podcast about building rockets capable of flying humans to Mars, and you only had one listener, but that listener was Elon Musk, for instance. How much could you charge for an ad slot on that show? Basically you can really name your price. So a very niche show with around 200 listeners might charge $150 per episode or even $500, while a podcast with 5,000 listeners based around a much more general topic might struggle to get a better deal than $20 CPM. So the good news is what? Good news is that if you own your podcast, as most do, then it's entirely up to you to know how much, or even set how much you want to charge. That doesn't necessarily mean someone will be willing to pay it. However, it means that there is no need to run ads if you are unhappy with the amount that sponsors are actually offering in the first place. You are in control. Think about that. You can also try affiliate sponsorships. Okay. And another model of podcast sponsorship is the affiliate commission route. Here you run ads in the same manner as I said a little earlier. Instead of being paid per episode or 1,000 downloads, payment is based on how many people actually buy the product or service. And this is a route many early stage podcasters go because it can be difficult to negotiate a good deal when you have a brand new show and a fledgling audience. The downside is that the downside is that there is no guarantee of any commission at all, right? Because you are actually thinking about scalability, but you also have a certain level of uncertainty. On the flip side, there is no cap on what you could potentially earn if your ads resonate with your audience. You also might want to think about dynamic ads. So some media hosts and agencies can set you up to run dynamic ads on your podcast. This means what? It means that you can earn from running ever updating radio style ads on all your episodes. An argument for this could be that any baked in ads you ran, like let's say 100 episodes ago, or 5 years ago, or 10 years ago, are still being played in your back catalog, but you're no longer earning from them. So while this is true, the rates in dynamic ads are pretty low. So it's one of those things where you have to see what works for your particular show and what doesn't work. So it's all about trials and errors, if you understand what I mean here. So I've actually talked to you about the pros of podcast sponsorship. I want to really talk a little bit about the downsides of this practice. I mean, things change the minute there is money involved, right? And your podcast is no exception, especially when you actually think of your podcast as a business. If you're a podcaster, unless you're doing this on the side, if you are really serious about actually making money in podcasting, you got to really think about the cash inflows and cash outflows are part of this equation. Now, if you are taking payment from anyone, you have an obligation to them, right? This can be a contractual obligation. It can be a legal obligation, because if anything happens and you do not actually follow through, you do not comply with the terms and conditions of the contract, they can sue your ass like crazy. Okay, so they are paying you for a service, and you need to actually deliver and try to keep them happy. The trick thing here is that you have to actually keep a lot of stakeholders happy, not just the person paying you for the ad or the sponsorship deal. You also have to think about keeping your audience happy, and your audience is the most important element here. Okay, up until now, if your podcast has been a hobby, you might have been able to miss the odd week if you were too busy or just didn't feel like hitting record. Right? Let's say if you do not want to hit record, that means, okay, I'm fine. This is just a hobby. This is just a side gig. I don't have any responsibility, any commitment. I'm not accountable to anybody else, okay, to a third party. But once you sign a contract and somebody else is actually giving you a little bit of cash, you are actually contractually obligated to actually comply with the rules. That really changed when someone has paid to advertise on your show, especially if those ads are time sensitive. Additionally, you have a duty to your audience. You have slowly built up a level of trust with them. What if they begin to question whether let's say your last episode was only released because you were getting paid to run an ad? In other words, they're thinking that you're not really thinking about adding value to their lives, but they're thinking about adding value to your own life. Take this all into consideration before deciding for sure that you want to go down the podcast sponsorship route. Remember too that if you are looking to earn from your content but don't like the idea of running ads, then other podcast monetization avenues are available. We have covered this actually on other shows, by the way. So when you think about how does podcast sponsorship work, you also have to think about how you can find a sponsor this year. Now, the cool thing is that you have a whole lot of there's an entire industry that's there to kind of help you out. Some media ad agencies and podcast hosting platforms can work with you to help set up a sponsorship agreement for your show. This is the middleman approach, which can be easier to get off the ground, but less fruitful in the long run. And typically, those services will look for a certain level of downloads too. And commonly, this is like a 5,000 US based downloads per new episode within the first month of its release. 5,000. Sometimes it can be 10,000, but 5,000 seems to be the average here. And most podcasts have significantly lower numbers than this, though. So this is something to really think about, okay? So if you have a smaller audience, you got to think about other ways to actually monetize it, but also find a sponsor. Now, for identifying potential sponsors, think of products or services you use that would also improve the lives of your listeners. This is totally topic dependent, but a few examples might be a running podcast where the presenter uses a particular piece of tech to measure her or his performance, a gardening podcast where the presenter uses a particular type of feed on his or her lawn, or a show about miniature wargaming where the presenter uses a particular company to buy paints and models. Okay, so each of these podcasters could reach out to the companies behind the products they use and make a pitch. It's all about making a pitch in the first place. And when you think about making a pitch, you got to have a certain foundation. What I call a certain foundation. What is it? Well, you got to have a media kit. A media kit is actually the fulcrum of your sponsorship journey. If you decide to actively seek out a sponsor, then it's a good practice to create a media kit for your podcast. So a media kit is actually the essential information about sponsoring your show, packaged up in an easy to read manner. You might create it as a design and illustrated PDF, either available on request or via direct download from your site. In the media kit, you want to include things like information about your audience, right? Their needs, wants, and pain points. So you are speaking here about their demographics, their geography, their their psychographics, their like everything that's important to a potential sponsor. You can also think about the role your podcast plays in your niche or topic, download and or engagement statistics, episode pricing and slot availability, links to sample of your audio, make it easy for your potential sponsors to hear you, and also some examples of listener reviews you've had, right? Also be sure that you make it easy for potential sponsors to contact you, because this isn't just relevant to folks seeking a podcast sponsor, but podcasters in general, because you never know here who's going to reach out to you. So what you want to do is you want to create a contact page on your website, and in there, list and link to every way someone can interact with you. That way you can have a clear idea how to start the monetization process there, okay? That's an important element to think about. So in terms of podcast sponsorship, there are a few steps you need to take next. Planning to approach a business about sponsoring your podcast. Use actually the video that we have created on how to sponsor a podcast, and you can create your pitch. Create also a media kit for your show. Also creating an audio trailer to present your work briefly. And if you're not really fully bought into the sponsorship route, but you want to explore monetization otherwise, there are other options that I have spoken about on other shows, by the way. In closing to this conversation, I spoke to you about how does podcast sponsorship work. I give you the overview, the methodology, the pro tips, the money, and also the closing arguments. Thank you so much. God bless you. I'll see you next time. Until then, remember, stay marvelous.